Luke this morning, chapter number 18. The Gospel of Luke, chapter number 18. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 18. And for our purposes of reasoning together this Sunday morning, we will commence reading with verse number 9 and conclude our reading with verse 14. Again, that is Luke chapter 18, commencing reading with verse number 9 and concluding with verse 14. And there, these divinely inspired words are recorded by the gospel evangelist. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a publican. And the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank thee, I am not as other men, exonerators, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice a week. I give tithe of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself shall be abased, and he that humble himself shall be exalted. The grass withers and the flower thereof fade, but the word of our God shall stand forever. I bumped into a thought last week that I want to pick back up on this Sunday morning. Tag this text, Offensive Grace. That's the title of this morning's message. Offensive grace. This is part 2 of that sermon. Offensive grace, part 2. I still believe and I still assert that of all of the language of the church, of all of the things that we say, there are certain words and certain things that the church need never get away from. There are certain vocabulary words that are singular to the church that many of us are either unfamiliar with or they no longer find great value in our 21st century articulation of our faith. Words like mercy, words like salvation, words like sanctification, words like glorification, words such as righteousness. These words are seemingly absent from the vocabulary of the church. How can we as believers say that we are born again, say that we have been washed in the proverbial blood of the Lamb? How can we as believers tout that we're on the right side when it comes to God if we do not know or practice sanctification? How can we say that we're on the right side when we don't realize what it means to be justified by faith? How can we say that we are on the right side when we shake and cannot give an answer to what it means to be righteous before God? These words are not just high pseudo church words that articulate theology. These words, salvation, justification, glorification, sanctification, these words articulate our entire faith belief. Because if you have been saved, if you have been washed, if you have given your heart to the Lord, the work that takes place in changing you is called sanctification. If you have been sanctified, if you are being sanctified, changed, formed, transformed, you are being sanctified by the work of the Holy Spirit, so that one day you will be glorified in heaven. If you have been and are being sanctified, your sanctification is maturing you so that you can live righteous before your God. That you can live righteous before your God and before your fellow man. All of these things are imperative language that I believe is tantamount and should never be erased from the dialogue of the church. But with these words, there still stands one other. There is one that I just believe should never get away from the church. And that word is the word grace. The word grace seems to be evaporating from our consciousness. We no longer take seriously the idea that God is a God of grace. Grace is not just favor. Grace, when we see it working in our life, is at best God giving us what we don't deserve when we need it most. I'm talking about grace. Grace is God giving you what you don't deserve, but what you need the most. And when we sit with this idea that God has always been behind the scene working in our favor, God is always behind the scene navigating the circumstances of our life to bring into our existence the right relationship with him so that we can leave this world and one day be in his presence. The idea that God has always been behind the scenes causing that which the devil and your enemies seem to want to work against you to work for you. How it is that God has always been behind the scenes grace that looks beyond our faults and supplies our need. The idea that God's grace is amazing, that God's grace is wonderful, that God's grace is abundant and exceeding, that there is no race that gets more grace, that there is no gender that gets more grace, that there is no ethnicity that gets more grace, or a social class when it comes to God that gets more or is entitled to more grace. That God gives grace freely is a reality that offends some of us. It offends us when we realize that God gives grace freely without reservation. That God gives grace to those who know that they need it. That God gives grace to those who call on him, those that dare approach and say to God, I need your, yes sir, grace. I know that I'm not everything I should be. I know that I am a work in progress. I know that I'm just clay on the wheel in the hands of a divine potter. I know that I've not made the right decisions all the time, but I need your grace. Your grace that forms me, into your image. Your grace that hears me while I'm still calling on you. Your grace that suffers for me. Your grace that died for me. Your grace that was buried for me. Your grace that rose for me. Your grace that intercedes for me. And your grace that will one day come to take me from this world. I need your, yes sir, grace. I struggle with this. I struggle with this because for many of us, we believe that we don't need God's grace. I'm still in my text. We believe that we don't need God's grace, that God is doing us some kind of favor by waking us up in the morning. That he's doing us some kind of favor, that we're in some quid pro quo relationship with God where we can tell him and command him and drive him and barter with him for that which is always free. His grace. His grace, it's always free. It's something we can't buy. It's something that we can't barter. And I've discovered something as I studied and sat with this text, is that our opinion about ourselves, how we see ourselves, reflects what we think of God and about his grace. This is the primary reason that Jesus tells this parable in Luke chapter 18. Luke says he tells this parable because sitting in his presence were those who trusted in their own right doing, but did not pay attention to the fact that their right doing had not created in them right being. Preach, Chris, to it. And child of God, let me just pause right there just to say to you that your right doing without right being is still unrighteousness. Your right doing, that means that you can do all the right things. You can give your tithe. You can come to church. You can do for the poor. You can practice your piety in public. But if your heart ain't been changed, if your mind hadn't been changed, if your nature ain't been changed, if you still see yourself better than somebody, your right doing is still unrighteousness until you've been changed on the inside. This man, this Jesus who challenges his hearer, not in this parable, he is not challenging them to offend them, so he's not challenging them to rub salt in an open wound. He's challenging them, hoping that they're going to change. And child of God, before I tell this parable, let me just say to you that it is not Christian to simply push your belief on anybody. That ain't Christian. It don't make you God-like. It don't make you like Jesus. If in telling the truth, your truth is meant to offend somebody. Jesus is tactful. Jesus, who tells his disciples that in your going and in your dealing, be as wise as a serpent, but harmless as a dove. He, in this parable, is trying to change somebody's mind. While I'm preaching this Sunday morning, I'm trying to change somebody's mind. And the target audience, he says, is those who trusted in their own self-righteousness. Listen at the story. He says, 2 men going to the temple for prayer. Two men going to the temple for prayer. One is a Pharisee. The other is a toll collector. He is a toll collector. He is, King James translation calls, a publican. It's a good word for somebody that works for the public works. He works for the government. He's considered an outcast. He's considered to be less than human. He's considered to be one who has turned his back on his upbringing, on his Jewishness. He is one who nobody likes. They don't like him in Jerusalem because he's a traitor, but they don't like him in Rome either, because while he is yet working for them, he is a traitor to his own. He's a man without a country. He's seen as low down because publicans were known to be double-tongued. They were known to be unscrupulous. They were known to use their power of governmental authority to harm rather than to hurt. These toll collectors would oftentimes double tax and overtax the people so that they can keep some money and put some money in their own pocket. That's why Matthew has to drop his books when he gets ready to follow Jesus. These toll collectors are not seen as people who deserve to be in the house of God. But Jesus says this toll collector is there with this publican, with this Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees, we've met them before. There's a religious elite. We've met them before. They are those that are pious in public. You know, they pray like they're supposed to. They know the law. They make sure others observe the law. But here's a little something you might not know. They are the ones in charge of collecting the temple tax. They're the ones that's in charge of making sure that everybody's tithe is paid. They're the ones who are to make sure that everybody in not just living the law are paying their portion of the upkeep, and instead of being kind to folk, Prince Chris Stewart, who don't have enough resources, they are as mean and vicious and low down as the people working for the government. And both of them come into the temple at prayer time. Listen at this Pharisee. Jesus lets us eavesdrop. He lets us do something we normally don't get to do. He lets us eavesdrop, not on the words only, but on the heart of the person also. Listen, when you hear it, it doesn't sound that bad at first. It doesn't sound that bad. This prayer, he says, God, I thank you. That's the first thing. I'm going to say it again. It don't sound bad when you hear it, because the first thing he says is, God, I thank you. He realizes that everything he has come from God. He realizes that everything that he is and everything that he ever will be, it comes from God. He thanks God, but he thanks him from preserving him from sin. And then he goes about to give an account of his fidelity of faith. He says, I'm exemplary in my fasting. I'm abundant in my tithing. He says all of this, but there are some other details that says and reveals that his righteousness ain't everything that it seems to be. Because while his prayer starts with God, his focus is on himself. Preach Chris Stewart. His prayer begins with God, but he focuses on his accomplishments. And while he acknowledges God as his source, with his focus on himself, he seems to need nothing from God. He seems to need nothing from God. He's judgmental. He labels others as being rapscallious, greedy, croakers, unjust, and adulterous, and in judging others, he is usurping God's authority. And child of God, this is why it's imperative that we look at this lesson, because all he has is because of God. Yet it has not made him even compassionate about other folk. He's the image of entitlement and elitism that is perversive in our current society. He is the image of the very elitism and entitlement that has burrowed into the hearts of our young, that make them not value another man's life. All right. He is the very image of the elitism and entitlement that allowed a Alabama Supreme Court justice to tout how much of a Christian he is and pass a ruling that says that life begins in the embryo, but not say to the legislature that they need to expand Medicaid. Here's the very elitism and the very entitlement that makes Donald Trump believe that he is immune to the law. He's the very elitism and the very entitlement that causes church folk oftentimes to judge and misjudge people that they are not in relationship with. He is not this Pharisee who seems righteous. This Pharisee who seems just. He says, God blessing me is good for you. If you keep blessing me, it's good for business. Keep blessing me, but don't do anything for that fellow over there. But in juxtaposition, as a image against, Jesus says there's another man that's there praying. He's in a corner. He don't want to be around anybody for fear of being found out. He's in a corner, hiding in the shadows, and won't even lift his eyes up because he's ashamed to look at God. He's ashamed that if he dares to approach God boldly, that God would tell him no. All right. He would have been instantly viewed by those in the crowd as being greeted and unclean, being dishonest. He won't look up because he feels that God can't have anything to do with him. He's been made to feel uncomfortable from the moment he walked in the door, but he knows, I got to get to God. Look at his posture. He shows how guilty he feels. He won't lift up his eyes. He knows that he's done some wrong. Listen at his process. He beats on his chest, which is an ancient sign of sorrow and mourning. Matter of fact, in Near East culture, men did not beat on their chest. Only women did. He debases himself in public. Listen at his plea. His plea is the very image of David's plea in Psalm 51. He says, God, what I need most is that you would do something about my sin problem. He takes Psalm 51:3, that have mercy on me, oh God, according to your tender mercy. He takes that and wraps it in his own words, and he says, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Says, look, I know they're making sacrifices in this temple. I know that they are atoning for sin in this place. I know that they're shedding blood in this place for sin to be accounted for. But God, while you are accepting their offering, would you please put some of that forgiveness on my account? All right. Child of God, right here is where our old wood flow saints would help me out. They would say, my mother prayed for me. She had me on her mind. Took some time and prayed for me. They would say, I'm so glad that she prayed. I'm so glad that she prayed, because they realize that there are some things that I've done in my life that I can't go back and fix. There are some folk that I wronged. I don't even know where they are anymore. There are some words that I said. I forgot the words, but I know that I offended somebody. So if you be so kind, Lord, put that balance, if you will, on my account. This man in his declaration is like the man on the cross who dared to say to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He's like that man because he is asking God to do something, and he hasn't done anything but ask. He is asking God to please have mercy on me. But unlike Zacchaeus, he's made no restitution. Unlike others, he can't even locate the person that he's wronged and beg their pardon. But Jesus says that this man is right with God, because unlike the Pharisee, he recognizes that in front of a holy God, that if anything happens to him, that it comes because of God's mercy. That if anything happens in his life, it is not because he was perfect. It is not because he fasted twice a week. It was not because he gave a tithe of all of his possessions. It was not because he was any better than any man. That if it happened for him, that it was because God had been merciful unto him. And Jesus says that's why when this man left the prayer meeting that day, that he was more righteous, he was more just than the other man. That he had been right with God and only wanted to be treated in light of the grace of God. Yes, and that's where I want to leave you on this third Sunday in Lent. I want to tell you that as we look toward Calvary, that we should remember that we're not any better than anybody else. We got to remember that all of us need the blood of Jesus. I said, ain't God all right? That all of us were too mean to live and wasn't fit to die. That all of us have sinned and come short of his glory. That all of us, even at our best, ain't nothing but filthy rags. But we must remember what John chapter 3 verse 16 says, that God so loved the world and he gave his only begotten Son, that whomsoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. God bless you, dear children, and we'll see you on Tuesday night. But I've just got one thing that I must tell you, that if you know that you didn't deserve grace, if you know that is nothing that you've done, I tell you, don't be mad, don't be shamed, and don't be offended when God is good to somebody else. When God is good to somebody else, don't be offended by that. Don't be offended because God let somebody else experience his love. All right. He didn't stop loving you just because he loved somebody else. Amen. The net is big. The tent is wide. Just because he let somebody else receive some of his grace doesn't mean he ran out of grace. Heads bowed now. God, we thank you.